When I begin the show every day as part of show prep, it is my obligation, I think, to you is what's the biggest story? What is the biggest story? Arguably, the Hunter Biden story is the biggest story. The trial, the prosecution is arrested, or maybe it's Joe Biden in Europe. Maybe it's Donald Trump on the campaign trail. Y'all, there is a story that I think is the biggest story that no one is paying attention to. And Charlie, we may have to put this in the See I Told You So file, and I hope we never have to replay the audio because I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. All you have to do is understand the motivations of what's going on around the world. And I need to begin with Africa. We're not talking about Africa. We're talking about something else, and I need you to stay with me. Let me paint broadly. Around the world, there is a growing axis between China, Russia, Iran, and their allied partners. Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, an axis of evil, although there are a lot of isolationists in this country who don't like it when you say that because it brings back memories of the war in Iraq. But there is an Eastern axis, you can call it, shaping up. And one of the things they're doing is they're setting fires around the world to stretch American resources. So consider Africa. In the Sahel, there has been that is the plains of Africa that are south of the Sahara Desert. There have been a series of military coups across that region, stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And those coups, we know for certain, have been backed by the Wagner Group out of Russia. So, for example, Niger has now thrown the United States out of a long-held military base in the Sahara in northern Niger. The Russians have moved in to take over that base. That base was designed to be able to get to centers of Islamic extremism rapidly to shut down terrorist attacks. And across the Sahel, the Islamic terrorists have been attacking. Now, you should understand, China, Russia, Iran, they're not fans of the Islamic terrorists. The Islamic terrorists hate the Iranians because the Iranians are the wrong branch of Islam. They hate the Russians because of Russia's involvement in Chechnya. They don't like the Chinese because of Western China's treatment of Muslims, including the Uyghur population. But these Islamic extremists are useful because it ties up the United States. Because above all else, the Islamic extremists hate the United States and Israel more than the others. So you throw us out of Niger, you do these series of coups in Africa, suddenly these strongman men come in, they throw us out, they bring the Russians in, and the Russians do not contain the Islamic terrorists who go off to wage war against American allies and plot the United States' revenge against us. So it bogs us down. Then you have Ukraine. The Russians having gone into Ukraine, we know they're using Chinese and Iranian weapons in Ukraine. They're distracting us in Ukraine. And by the way, this is a matter of all of Europe and the United States together working, because we do know that Vladimir Putin's grand ambition is to reorder a Russian sphere of influence that includes all those countries that used to be behind the Iron Curtain. Now, let's go to Asia. If you have seen the newspapers in the last few days, the Chinese have been very antagonistic towards the Philippines, towards Taiwan, towards Vietnam. They've built a series of artificial islands in the South China Sea in shallow water. They have expanded their footprint. They're claiming as Filipino territorial water their own. They've sent the Chinese Coast Guard to harass Filipino fishermen. They encircled Taiwan last week to the extent Taiwan nearly ran out of natural gas. They've been harassing the Vietnamese so much, the Vietnamese are looking to the Americans for help, which is unusual in the least. It's got the American Navy bogged down in the South China Sea, trying to help the Filipinos, and the American Navy is helping, of all things, the communist Vietnamese. The communist Vietnamese and the communist Chinese are no longer friends. The Chinese look at them as rivals who should be in their sphere of influence. The Vietnamese look at themselves as an independent nation. They don't want to be in the sphere of influence. Now, this all gets me to where we need to focus. This is a story that on its surface is no big deal. 3 Russian Navy ships and a nuclear-powered submarine will arrive at the port of Havana for an official visit next week, the Cuban Armed Forces said in a statement Thursday, confirming the military exercises first disclosed by U.S. officials on Wednesday. The Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces said it'll be a Russian missile frigate, nuclear submarine, oil tanker, and salvage tug. They'll arrive June 12th and stay for a week. The Cuban military said the visit by the Russian Navy ships is part of a friendly relationship between the two countries, complies with international law, and does not pose a security threat to the region because none of the ships will be carrying nuclear weapons. Do we believe them? That in and of itself is not extraordinary. This is not a situation like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians have visited the port of Havana several times, but this is coming while something is happening that no one seems to be paying attention to. This is from CNN from the middle of May 14th. Venezuela continues to build up military infrastructure and hardware close to the border with Guyana, and President Nicolas Maduro and his supporters scale up their threats to annex an oil-rich piece of Guyanese land. In a report shared with CNN, the Washington-based think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies warns that while the Venezuelan government has little to gain and much to lose from a full-blown conflict, it continues to play a dangerous game over its claim over the densely forested Essequibo region. The constant drumbeat asserting the Essequibo as ours, alongside the creation of new military commands and legal structures to oversee the defense of the region, is helping to institutionalize a sense of perpetual pre-war footing, it wrote. Tension over the region, which amounts to about 2/3 of Guyanese national territory, mounted last year after a Venezuelan referendum in which voters assented to creating a Venezuelan state within the disputed region. Guyana had called the move a step towards annexation and an existential threat as the specter of armed conflict loomed over the region. Now, there's a huge piece of land in Guyana that has a lot of oil under it, and American oil companies Hess, Exxon, and Chevron have been exploring it. In fact, there's a deal between Chevron and Hess to merge. Exxon is opposing the deal now and putting it in arbitration because Exxon wants this region for itself and wants to obstruct the Hess-Chevron merger because Exxon, which has ties as well to a Chinese oil conglomerate in this operating region, wants the oil. Anacoco Island, there's a military base that the Venezuelans have. It's in a river. And they've been building up their military. And guess who's there? Do you have any idea who is at Anacoco Island according to the private intelligence operations of the oil companies? The Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranian Revolutionary National Guard, Quds forces. This comes from private sector military intelligence operations. The oil companies in areas like South America have their own intelligence operations for their safety and security, and they're warning everyone the Iranians are there, the Russians are there, and the Chinese are there. Not making this up. The Russians, Chinese, and Iranians are training the Venezuelan military, which has engaged in a massive military buildup on the border of Guyana to take an oil-rich section of land that American oil companies have the rights to. So right now, Joe Biden has authorized Venezuela to sell oil on the open market, along with turning a blind eye to Iran. Venezuela is now getting the money from what Joe Biden has allowed them to do, and Iran is getting the money from what Joe Biden has allowed them to do. Iran is turning its money towards terrorism. Venezuela is turning its money to its military. Venezuela is building up its military with the sale of oil that Joe Biden authorized, so that it, with the training from the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese, can invade an oil-rich section of Guyana where American oil companies have the rights and access to the oil, where if the American oil companies get the oil, guess who it benefits? Us. This is from CNN. 2 Iranian-built PACAP-3 fast missile boats have been seen at Venezuelan small Coast Guard station at Punta Barima, placing Venezuelan military and naval forces within arm's reach of the Guyana-administered Essequibo. It's just 40 miles from the Guyanese border. Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians working together in their eastern axis have been setting a series of fires around the world to distract the United States. You bog down the United States in South America and in Africa and in the Middle East and in Europe. Who's to watch Guam? Who's to watch Midway Island? Who's to watch the Philippines? You tie us down around the world, taxing our resources because the American military has been scaled back under Barack Obama. Remember, Barack Obama made a conscious decision when he was president of the United States that the United States no longer needed to be on a war footing to be able to win two wars on two separate spheres at the same time. Since World War II, the United States decided it needed a military that could win a war in the Pacific and a war in the Atlantic at the same time. What Barack Obama's genius decided to do was scale back the American military so that it would only win one of those wars, but would have enough resources to at least draw to a standstill the war on the other until the first could be won. It's a stupid idea. The Chinese have been building military capacity to be able to win two wars in two spheres. The Russians want to dominate Europe. They need us distracted elsewhere so that they can take back Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia and move further across Ukraine. It's one reason they've wanted to tie up the Crimea. This is so obvious. They're moving chess pieces around on the board while Joe Biden is tripping over his feet and at war with the English language. The Democrats are asleep at the switch. We have Russians, Chinese, and Iranians inside Venezuela right now training their military as they prepare to invade a sovereign nation and take an oil-rich territory where it's American companies that have the oil contracts. This is happening on Joe Biden's watch. War is coming to the Western Hemisphere. It is probably not a coincidence that the Russians are sending the top of their fleet, including their bleeding-edge nuclear submarine, to Cuba this week. Wonder who they're going to be talking to in Cuba. And no one in the American press corps is paying attention to this because they're obsessed with Trump and the Trump trial. War is coming to the Western Hemisphere at the hands of our enemies as they try to degrade American sovereignty around the world. It's clear and obvious the chess pieces are being put forward on the board. Joe Biden's asleep and the media doesn't care because it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. But you should care and you should pay attention. And if I am right, and I think I am, I don't need to say I told you so, because there's going to be hell to pay when this happens, and it's going to affect the stock market. It's going to affect the global economy if Venezuela goes into this oil-rich region, which they say they're going to do as soon as the monsoon season goes away, and does so with the help of the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians, all of whom are there right now training the Venezuelan military, while Joe Biden does absolutely nothing except allow Venezuela to sell oil to fund its military excursions.